Hi, I'm Davy. I'm awesome. Welcome to Davy's Awesome Wrestling, where I review wrestling-related things all from the perspective of a fan, not an insider. And this week, I'm reviewing a fairly old wrestling documentary. It's currently on the WWE Network on Peacock, and for fans of wrestling history, it's definitely a good one. I'm reviewing the WWE documentary, The Spectacular Legacy of the AWA. It opens with the owner-operator of AWA, Verne Gagne, and his start, how he started out as a football player for the Green Bay Packers, but back then that wasn't the money-making job that it is now. Like nowadays, even the lowest paid football player can be a football player full-time. Back then, not really. So he was also getting into professional wrestling. But at one point, he got traded to the Bears, and that coach said, you need to pick one, wrestling or football. He picked wrestling. And basically did what everybody was doing back then. This was the territory days where he went from city to city to city wrestling in there, hoping to become the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, the official recognized World Heavyweight Champion. But through politics, they would not award him the title. Too many people were afraid that if he had the title, he'd basically just keep it in his little area. So he broke away from the AWA, bought out a territory, and renamed it the American Wrestling Association, the AWA, up there in Minnesota. And of course, he makes himself the AWA champion, which some people looked at that as ego. Some people said, well, it just comes down to you want to put the title on somebody you can trust. There were no contracts back then. Who can you trust more than yourself? Either way, as a wrestling history buff, I look at it like whether or not it was ego or it was the trust issue. Are people going to sit there and say he wouldn't have been a credible champion? Of course he was. And then went into his legendary feuds, more than one, with Nick Bockwinkel. One of, in my opinion, the best heels that was ever in the business. Especially because now we look at that like, it's been done, but at that time it hadn't. A heel that was not only constantly praising himself, but just that arrogant heel, the guy using the $10 words and making people around him feel stupid and inferior. That wasn't really something that had been done a lot yet. And he not only started it, but revolutionized it. So much so that now every time we get a heel like that, we go like, oh, he's like Nick Bockwinkel. But then it also goes into, in my opinion, what was the biggest contribution of the AWA. His training school. That he ran out there in Minnesota, where it was very, very cold, very, very brutal, but he trained these men to be tough. And some of the wrestlers, to his accolades, holy crap, it's like a who's who of wrestlers that he trained. Legendary wrestlers like Ric Flair trained there. And it even went into when he officially retired from active wrestling and the story of him wanting to go out on top, wanting to be the first person to retire as champion, so winning the title on his last match. And again, some people might criticize that, but you know what? It was his company. And it goes into the biggest star he ever had and lost. The one who would go on to be the biggest star, arguably in wrestling history, Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan had been blackballed by the WWF for taking that part of Thunder Lips in Rocky III. Greg Gagne, Verne's son, saw it as an opportunity. This guy has not only got a good look, he's not only got charisma, but now he has a little bit of star power. Let's get him in the AWA. And they did. And he was very successful in the AWA. He was making huge strides in there, on his way to being the AWA champion. But he felt Verne Gagne was not being straight with him. First of all, Verne Gagne basically believed that if he gave his title to Hulk Hogan, that entitles Hulk Hogan to give him some of his money that he's going to go make in Japan. Because, again, this is the territory days. Nobody was one territory. And one of the big things was to get into Japan. And Hogan was big in Japan. I mean, he's the first IWGP World Heavyweight Champion, for crying out loud. But he felt that did not entitle Verne Gagne to any of his Japan money. Hogan was also one of the first people to start doing merchandise, which, as we know, has been a huge moneymaker in wrestling. And he said that basically Verne Gagne, without his permission, was selling his merchandise at shows while he was in Japan and not giving him any money. So this kind of stuff led to Hogan accepting an offer from Vince McMahon to go to the now WWF and wrestle over there. Because not only the money stuff, Verne Gagne decided to find a way to not give him the title, and some people would argue about the way that Hogan went. There's rumblings and disputing saying that Vince McMahon told him, I'll pay you more not to fulfill your commitments in AWA. Vince McMahon was on the documentary saying he's always been big on people, fulfill your commitments, keep your word, but that's up to you. one way or another on that, Hogan did not fulfill his commitments with the AWA. He just left. Even though he'd done interviews and promos leading up to his next 6 weeks and never fulfilled them. My personal belief on this, which is just a belief, I don't know, as competitive as Vince McMahon was, for a lot of guys, he always let them fulfill their commitments. He never stopped anybody from fulfilling their commitments. Hogan is known for lying to make himself look better. So, I don't think Vince McMahon told him no. I think Hogan was just angry and bitter and left. But then this went into what started the downfall of the AWA. Not just Hogan leaving, but other people seeing the writing on the wall and going with him. A lot of their big stars, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Jesse Ventura, and so many others, decided to follow suit and go to the WWF, at the time what they called New York, because they saw the writing on the wall. This is the next big company. Especially because Verne Gagne, it goes into the second thing that was basically his downfall, not changing with the times. This was something that killed a lot of the territories, was that they all wanted to keep doing business the way they'd been doing it. Vince McMahon came along, was going to break the rules, and he was going to be national. He was not going to stay just in New York. He was going to expand all the way around America. And I've talked about this before. They mentioned it in this one too. If he didn't do it, somebody else was going to do it. Because with the expansion of cable, basically us being able to watch the same thing no matter whether we were in New York or California, it was going to happen. Local television was dying. Now it's hardly a thing. Like, yes, we still have local channels, but who watches them? Drunks in a bar. That's about it. If Vince McMahon didn't decide to nationally expand, somebody else was gonna. But Verne Gagne was one of those that was like, no, I'm going to stick to my territory, and we need to stop him from going to our territory. And as a way to try to get back at him, tried to get into Vince McMahon's territory, New York, and that didn't really work out for him, because it turns out that people in New York get entertained by something different than people in Minnesota. But after trying to expand in New York did not work out for him, Vince McMahon's doing pay-per-views and stuff like that. Verne Gagne decided, let's just get with all the other promoters and do Super Clash. Jim Ross was on this talking about how at the time he was working for Mid-South, which later became the UWF, Bill Watts' territory, and they opted out. They said this is not going to work. And it didn't. Because they had a bunch of other NWA territories in there, like Jim Crockett, WCCW, and so on and so forth, just a bunch of them. And you had all these different promoters, all these different egos, all them wanting to make their territories look stronger. It basically just became a big, huge mess. But after this, things started turning around. He got on ESPN, which was a new channel at the time, but still, it's a sports channel, it's national. You could watch the AWA everywhere you were. But the problem is that even though they were getting traction, they were building up some new stars, it was pretty clear that all those new stars were basically just waiting to get a call from either Jim Crockett or the WWF. It basically became like this was now a breeding ground. Kind of like what would later become whatever the third promotion is. It's always just kind of a breeding ground. Now, it didn't really talk about Super Clash 2, which I imagine is probably because it wasn't worth mentioning, but it mentioned Super Clash 3, where this time it was just 3 of them. It was the AWA with WCCW and CWA. So the 3 legendary promoters were Gagne, Fritz Von Erich, and Jerry Jarrett. And Vince McMahon mentioning in it that he was not worried about this show of them bringing all their wrestlers together on one show, because he said these 3 egos could not order a cup of coffee together, let alone put on a wrestling show. And basically turned out to be the way it was. Again, it was a big, just giant mess. And in this one, they were unifying the WCCW World Championship with the AWA World Championship. Kerry Von Erich versus Jerry Lawler, which had, at the time, what I would have considered, if I was a fan watching, a very cheap win. Jerry Lawler won, unifying those titles by referee stoppage because Kerry Von Erich was bleeding too much. And I can tell you this as a fan, if I would have ordered this pay-per-view back in the day, waited for that main event, been excited about it, and that would have been its finish, Kerry Von Erich almost winning, but then the referee deciding to stop it and award it to Jerry Lawler, I'd have felt very gypped. But that's the way it went. Jerry Lawler is the AWA champion, which is now also the world-class champion. But the problem there, Verne Gagne never paid Jerry Lawler, which they talked about it. Jerry Lawler to this day was never paid for Super Clash, which was supposed to be like their WrestleMania. He understood he had to wait some time, but when the paycheck never came, And they said, okay, well, we've booked you here. He had the attitude that most people would have, which is, okay, well, I'm not doing any other shows until you paid me for this one. So that was it. They decided to crown a new champion. And that champion became Larry Zbyszko, who was Vern Gagne's son-in-law. Which, I'm not trying to knock Larry Zbyszko. Yes, he was a decent wrestler. He had great mic skills, but if I'm one of the other two big companies and your champion's Larry Zbyszko, I'm not worried. But then the final nail in the coffin for the AWA turned out not to be anything wrestling related, just simply an eminent domain issue. I don't like to get political in these videos, but this is the one that I really think is one of the most criminal things that our government can do. That they can sit there and say, we see that your property can be used for what we think would be better, so we're going to take it from you, give you a fair price, and that's going to be that. I think it's something that we need to tell the government you don't get to do anymore. Especially because we need to remember they work for us, not the other way around. Because even if they can use it for something really, really good, it doesn't matter. It's my property. I bought it. If I don't want to sell it to you, then I shouldn't have to. Or maybe I'm like, okay, I'll sell it to you, but I don't want it at a fair price. I want you to pay me more than what's fair. It's my property. But in this case, Vern Gagne owned a part of Lake Minnetonka up in Minnesota. They wanted it. They tried to take it, and he spent thousands and thousands, maybe even a couple $1,000,000 in lawyer and court fees trying to keep his property that he had legally purchased was his, and ended up losing the case. Because that's one thing that kind of sucks when it comes to a legal dispute with the government. Good luck. They can afford a lot more lawyers than you can, no matter how rich you are. And to keep that lawsuit going, he was borrowing against the AWA with the intent to put it back if he won the suit, and he didn't. They didn't have the money to keep the AWA going. It was either fold the NWA or he retires with literally nothing. And then it goes into, again, the legacy of the NWA. All the stars that came out of NWA, whether he trained them or not, he made them stars. Just way too many to name. Wrestling would not be where it is today without the AWA. Which is why it also ended with Vern Gagne being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. People going like, why? He was never part of WWE. Okay, but WWE doesn't deny. It wouldn't be where it was without the AWA. Even though, yes, Vince was their competitor. This was the number 3 company. And since then, there's always been a number 3 company. But I will say that I don't think there was ever a number 3 company that was so close to gaining and taking over the number 2 spot than the AWA. AWA folded around 1990, so I had been born by that point, but I wasn't really an avid wrestling fan yet. As far back as I can remember wrestling, it was WWF, WCW, ECW. ECW, where it was number 3 easily, it was nowhere close to being WCW. But it was, like the AWA, the feeder system. A lot of the big stars at that time came from ECW. But that all started with the AWA, and wrestling would not be where it is today without it. So, as far as this documentary goes, if you are like me, a wrestling history buff, you just love to learn more about the history of wrestling, how it got to where it is today, and you haven't seen the spectacular legacy of the AWA, then I suggest go to Peacock, find it, watch it, because it's very eye-opening, it's very interesting, and I only tapped into what they talked about. I would not have time to talk about everything they talked about in one Davy's Awesome Wrestling, but it's one of my favorite documentaries that WWE has come out with. So there you have it. That's my wrestling review this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell so you get notifications for when I post new videos, and leave a comment I can respond to in my next comment corner. If you've seen the spectacular legacy of the AWA, tell me what you thought of it. If you are old enough to remember the AWA, tell me what you thought of it. Love you guys.